In many discussions about current and future warfare, the subject of contractors is frequent, often implying that we are outsourcing war. That is the subject of this episode of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. Welcome to The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. I'm Chris Mayer, retired U.S. Cavalry Colonel, former instructor of the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College, the Naval War College, and contract faculty for the Army War College. Last week, I attended the annual summit meeting of the International Stability Operations Association, or ISOA. To be completely transparent, I'm a member of ISOA's Advisory Council. ISOA consists of 200 private corporations that support U.S. and friendly government engagement across the spectrum of stability, conflict, and post-conflict operations. The conference included presentations by government representatives from the U.S. Departments of Defense, State, Justice, Commerce, and USAID, representatives of the Ukrainian government, experts in cyber technology and artificial intelligence, and speakers currently providing private sector support in hostile environments. Generals, ambassadors, and CEOs. All these presentations are of keen interest to ISOA members, companies that provide material and services to almost every facet of contingency operations, except direct participation in combat. Governments, and not just the U.S. government, increasingly rely on private sector support to respond to disasters and in support of combat and post-combat operations. Why is this, and should we be concerned about it? Contractor support to military operations is not new. Throughout history, armies depended on support from the private sector. Transportation, food services, bath and laundry, medical support, engineering, and so on were regularly contracted. Combat was also contracted out, but I covered that in previous episodes. For much of history, this support was often described as, somewhat derisively, as camp followers. Nonetheless, these camp followers were considered an essential part of the military force of a state. The very first codification of the laws of war in the modern era, the Lieber Code, specifically mentioned this private sector support, stating, quote, "Citizens who accompany an army for whatever purpose, such as sutlers, editors, or reporters of journals, or contractors, if captured, may be made prisoners of war and be detained as such." Every restatement of the laws of war since then included the legitimate presence of contractors accompanying the armed forces. If contractor support has been such an important feature of war for so long, why does it seem to be so remarkable today? One reason might be the era of mass conscription in the 20th century. When every able-bodied male citizen could be called up for military service, it seemed less expensive and simpler to provide all of those services in-house. The commander then had direct control and authority over his support. No need to worry about contract negotiations, and that support couldn't just decide to leave if things got too dangerous and go home. Even then, however, much of our support was contracted. Construction engineering, port operations, and air transport are just a few areas that were heavily contracted out in World War II. As just one example, more than 80% of U.S. airlift was contracted out. The aircrew wore uniforms that resembled standard military uniforms, and the planes were painted olive drab with U.S. stars on the wings, but the pilots, ground crew, and the planes were provided by the airlines. In many cases, the name of the airline still appeared over the door of the plane, and pilots frequently insisted on wearing their company's flight cap. The same was true for much of the technical support in the field, even in forward combat zones. When the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh went to the Pacific Theater to show pilots how to get the most out of their fighters, he did so as an employee of the Ford Motor Company. This leads to another reason why contractor support seems to be so much more visible today: the increasing technical complexity of war. As war becomes more technological, military forces depend more and more on expertise that resides in the private sector. As technical support becomes more intense, so too does the presence of contract support ensuring that the planes, tanks, missiles, trucks, and computers are ready to fight. Today, in the West at least, conscript armies are rare. The peoples of Western countries neither support conscription nor are willing to pay the cost of maintaining large standing armies. The U.S. Army, for example, is now smaller than it was during the Great Depression, when the population was less than half of what it is today, and the nation was unprepared for war. Today, every soldier, airman, Marine, or sailor must be trained and focused on the core function of the armed forces: to fight and win. To the greatest extent possible, therefore, supporting functions are provided by the private sector, as required, when required. The essential role of contractors to modern military operations is so important that Franklin Kramer of the Atlantic Council is promoting the concept of private sector support as the sixth domain of war, the other five being land, air, sea, space, and cyber. The importance of the private sector cannot be understated, although I would rather consider that support as integral to each of the other domains rather than a separate domain by itself. There is, of course, a risk in contracting out essential military support. War is a dangerous business. As I mentioned earlier, decisive combat operations is not the time to worry about contract terms demanding civilians perform under fire, or to worry about labor actions such as a strike or other non-performance of essential services. The armed forces must, therefore, maintain the ability to provide this support, called logistics in military speak, when the exposure to combat is inherent to the provision of essential support. Traditionally, this logistics capability is drawn from the reserve component. The ability to mobilize and deploy reserve forces is not, of course, comparable to that of active duty forces. As a result, even when we will use the reserve component, we may find it necessary to use private sector support to fill the gap until the reserves arrive in theater. Another risk is private sector accountability in armed conflict. Contractors are included under the law of war with the understanding that their actions are accountable under the law of war or other relevant national law. I described some of the challenges and solutions to this accountability in Episode 5. Existing methods of accountability, however, are largely specific to the U.S. Department of Defense. Other countries and even other departments of the U.S. government do not have clear mechanisms for that accountability. Every military operation, from overarching strategy to small unit tactics, requires a balance of ends, ways, and means. The means are the resources necessary, appropriate, and available to perform tasks necessary to achieve the objective or end state. Every resource has its strengths and weaknesses. Each must be identified as available and suitable and, as necessary, requested and integrated into the plan. These resources include private sector support. By its nature, planners must request private sector capabilities and integrate them into planning at the earliest possible opportunity. The Army's Logistics Civil Augmentation Program, or LOGCAP, exists to provide that private sector support. However, specific support requirements require discrete task orders, which the different LOGCAP providers will bid on. This takes time. There are other options. Going back to the example of aviation, the Department of Defense has contracts with more than 20 airlines to provide airlift in the event of contingency operations. This is called the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, or CRAF. Participating airlines must respond in as little as 24 hours after notification. I think it would be wise for DoD to establish private sector support agreements to provide responsive private sector logistics capabilities similar to the CRAF model for all domains of military operations. So now you know. Contractors have been part of war from the very beginning. They are more obvious today for a variety of reasons, including increasing technical support requirements and the relative size of standing armies. Nonetheless, the military must retain in-house capabilities for support where the line between support and combat disappears.